Hi, I'm Jean-Michel and welcome to the show. And today we are joined by one of the brightest minds in the blockchain industry, the founding father of IBM Hyperledger, Mr. Gurvinder Ahluwalia. Let's jump in. Gurvinder, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Good, Jean-Michel. It's so good to see you.
Likewise.
Thank you for inviting me to the show and the discussion.
Thank you for being here. It's been a minute. So we've known each other for some time, but I think it's best we start with a little bit of an intro about who you are, what it is you do, and what's your interest in the blockchain space.
Okay, well, thanks for introducing me. Again, my name is Gurvinder Ahluwalia. I'm based in Dallas, Texas, and had most of my professional training and career in the United States. I'm originally from India. I'm the founder and CEO of Digital Twin Labs, which is kind of think of it like a venture studio where we invite innovation from startups and enterprises and other participants. Previously, my background is in large tech environments. I've done stops at Motorola, which is where I started my career. And it was kind of the first bookend of my career where I had the privilege of deploying the second largest TCP/IP network of the world back at that time. So putting in the plumbing at that time. And the reason I note it that way is because I'll fast forward in a few minutes to kind of where we are. And that is a whole new kind of plumbing that all of us are involved in putting in place now around blockchain. But anyway, in between, I made stops at Accenture, at Texas Instruments. I had the privilege of launching the first embedded Linux handheld-based device into the US market, and then turned my career into the next wave of technology, which was around cloud and IoT. And my last corporate innings was at IBM, where I was the CTO for IBM's blockchain, IoT, and cloud business, and also was privileged to co-found the IBM blockchain business, and in parallel co-found the open source Hyperledger Linux Foundation movement. Of course, since removing my IBM uniform in 2017, when I formed Digital Twin Labs, I've been working more agnostically with different kind of blockchains. So to close out on the current bookend of where I am in my journey, it's stewarding the industry and putting in, with help from people like you and many others, putting in what I would say as kind of the next generation of plumbing for the internet with incentives and governance. So I'm sure we'll be talking more about that. But back to you.
Absolutely. So you've had a spectacular career, I think, to say the least. One which I'm sure you've worked extremely hard for. So what was it about 2017 that made you want to step away from that traditional direction and do things differently?
I won't get into specifics on the direction IBM took, but by now it's well known on the direction that IBM took, which was towards permissioned private networks. And the way I looked at it is blockchains and, more broadly speaking, decentralized ledger technology and networks are going to be more ubiquitous. They're going to be highly decentralized, meaning the governance particularly. And I wanted to have the opportunity to work with multiple technologies. Of course, when you're with a technology provider, then you're mostly restricted to working with, their set of product family and technologies, even if it isn't the open source. There also was a challenge that a single technology provider cannot outpace the innovation of the open source world. And we've seen that time again. And particularly, I would cite the Ethereum ecosystem was innovating very, 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 very fast. So in some sense, I had the privilege of, kind of co-pioneering the first generation of business and enterprise blockchains. I had the privilege of implementing the proof for the use of blockchain for the first time in a business context, meaning for business use cases for the first time in the planet. And that was shared widely and received very well with the industry and the media. But then the opportunity had to be much larger because we all know where the numbers are headed, despite the ups and downs of the crypto market, which is separate from what I would say the blockchain base. That this has to be an area where I have to play more widely with different technologies. And then, of course, I wanted the autonomy of things, doing things on my own, which you have great latitude when you're, get into an entrepreneurial kind of a venture like I am.
Absolutely. So it's you touched upon something very interesting there, Guri, which is your let's say not so obvious disdain for private and permission chains, right? So you have a very particular set of experiences under your belt, right? Like rolling out a TCP/IP network, like one of the first TCP/IP networks out there, is no small feat, right? And you've seen multiple generations of tech change the world and change the way everyone does things. And to be able to have done that, you saw things way earlier than everyone else did, and way earlier than it affected everyone else's lives, right? So what is it about private and permission chains that you see that you personally aren't all right with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I would say is that you do get an opportunity working with frontier technology, working at the leading wave of disruption and technology. I try not to call it disruption because it's really not a technological phenomenon. It's more of a phenomenon explained by economics. But nevertheless, when you work with large technologies, change doesn't happen easily, and the entire diffusion process. So I'll give you an example. Like for some period of, and then I'll come, more directly to your question. For some period of my career, as I mentioned, I worked with embedded systems and launched to the market, one of the first handheld based on embedded Linux. This is before tablets and Apple, iPad and all were fashionable. I'm talking about circa 2003, 2004.
So just to be clear, I'm sorry to interrupt. Like, because 2003, 2004 was before the first iPhone, right? So we're talking about like a Linux embedded device used in an enterprise setting?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So Linux before that was used only in back-end server data center environments. And, obviously, as we know, put a crunch on, Windows servers. But the use of Linux in edge devices and embedded systems was a later phenomenon. And so the project that I'm referring to was an EdTech end user product, a handheld device. Think of it as a forerunner to what iPad was, and had all the bells and whistles, except it was very clunky, it was big, and it was heavy, just like the original cell phone was. But my point over there, Jean-Michel, is that, and in parallel during that time, I also got a chance to work with. We are now in 5G, right? So at that time it was 3G. So I worked on 3G, handset terminals, and I'm coming to your point on having the advantage of being able to foresee technology. And if you miss a certain cycle in telecom, in putting your base in, then you don't get another window until about another 7 years, right? Now that is very unique about infrastructure. And that is the reason infrastructure is called infrastructure. And that's the reason it's called plumbing, because it's hard to change it. And if you miss a certain window, the next window doesn't happen until 7 years. But that also means that if you're working on a certain technology now, that after 7, 8, 10 years is when it will penetrate. So believe it or not, I was working, now this technology that we are using, I was working on video conferencing through cell phones in 2004, 2005. And the reason it was because that's when the chip vendors are working on it. Now, nothing gets deeper in an infrastructure than, chip and silicon level. So, right. So that's when the chip technology begins to accommodate what at an application level is known as, the technology that we are using right now. And that is what, FaceTime video from Apple and other video capabilities on cell phones is. I'm not talking about laptop. It started at the chip level. So when you're working at certain infrastructure level and other technologies, you're able to foresee when that wave will really begin to penetrate into applications and consumerization. So more directly now to your question around private permissioned kind of blockchains, that taxonomy and that mental framework to organize the understanding of blockchains, whether they're private and public, whether they're permissioned versus permissionless, that 2x2 matrix, if you may, was an organizing paradigm for simplicity, even though the aspect of being private is very, very important to enterprises, right? So that aspect became very, very emphasized in kind of establishing a taxonomy of blockchains around the time when I got into the blockchain space, which is 2013, 2014, more realistically, and then it started taking, some early contours in 2015, and then the business units and the open source movement started in 2016. Now, of course, Ethereum was at work, prior to that. So when the first enterprise use case of using blockchain was proven in the work that me and a few others did at IBM in collaboration with Samsung, which incidentally was a IoT smart home use case. It was a prototype, but then the enterprise hardening and the requirements began to dominate, right? So what is important in the discussion of private permissioned is not so much private and permission, but it is more privacy. So I would shift the lens on the aspect and the feature and the functionality of privacy, whether that privacy comes from a private blockchain or a public blockchain, then becomes a lower rung of discussion. So the first set of enterprise business blockchains really went after, let's keep it private, let's keep it permissioned. And that's not a good or bad argument. It is an argument of the reality on where the maturity of blockchains and where the maturity of being able to implement privacy was. And the ability to implement privacy required private, required permissioned kind of blockchains. Let me just pause over there, give it back to you.
No, it's an interesting way to look at it. So I was always of the mind that permissioned chains and private chains were the enemy, at least for the sort of first few years of getting into this industry, right? And then after a while, once you make certain realizations, you realize that the technology itself is agnostic, right? And it's the way in which it's utilized is actually what's bad. However, you made an important distinction in that last point, which was that what we really should be focusing on is not whether it's permissioned or permissionless, but where do the privacy aspects of the project come into play, right? So how is it, or do you think it's possible to have a private and open blockchain, like something like Solana a public and open blockchain, something like Solana or Avalanche or anything like that, and somehow still create the privacy requirements for enterprises?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jean-Michel. And the way I organize my thoughts, and also the way I'm, kind of advancing at least my perspective in the industry. And as you know, I was invited to give a few talks at Davos, and this incidentally was one of the topics recently. And it is like, in some sense, the first, what I'm referring to as the first generation of enterprise or business blockchains, right? Started from, let's say, 2015, 2016. And in some sense are beginning to now, at best we can say blur, but at worst we can, even say there's sort of a demise of it happening. And there is some example of certain ventures and platforms shutting down, like the most remarkable recent one is TradeLens, which was one of the largest referenceable works came out of IBM. And might I confess that had my early, fingerprints on it. But that is the first generation of enterprise, business blockchains. And the shift now is towards what I'm referring to as the second generation of business blockchains. And you named a few of those, but I think the aspect of privacy is still important. Now, this data point I'm headed to quote from Salesforce might be a little bit dated, but directionally it's still useful. The design point of privacy is very important for enterprises. Don't get me wrong, but I think one of the Salesforce surveys a few years ago found out that only something like 6-7% of enterprise data is truly sensitive data, right? So we base the design and the use and the platforming of 100% of the data of an enterprise and the flows only because of 6% of it is, privacy sensitive, right? So there really isn't any fine granularity and separation and isolation and chiseling of the data, right? So that is a flaw in the narrative around enterprise and privacy, okay? So we have to be very, very specific when we say privacy, what portion of the data is really private. Now, of course, the sledgehammer approach and the easier approach is that, everything is private because it's too much work and there probably isn't visibility on what portion of the data is truly private. So that's point number one. The second point is the model that is emerging for the second generation, or one of the models that is emerging for second generation enterprise business blockchains is a tiered structure of blockchains where you have I'm going to take the example of the Ethereum ecosystem because that's demonstrating the most maturity, but that's not to say that other scenarios and solutions, will not emerge from other kinds of blockchains, but I'm referring to layer 2 protocols, right? So you have layer 2 protocol and it's a vibrant ecosystem within the Ethereum ecosystem where you can deploy private instances of a certain enterprise use case on layer 2 and then be able to share through economic attestation that is available from the layer 1 public protocols, proofs for data that need to be shared at the same time keeping them private. So I'm alluding to zero knowledge proofs where you don't reveal how you arrive at that proof, but you're able to provide the verification and the proof of a certain data and the privacy associated with it.
ZK is one of those options, and I see it as a technical solution for using or for introducing privacy on public infrastructure. I think the problem with zero knowledge proofs becomes explaining it to the people in power and the people that be exactly how it generates its integrity. It's like, how do you explain to a regulator, okay, yes, sure, this person isn't over 18 because that's what the ZK algo says. That's such a mind-blowing barrier to get over. Like, how do you deal with something like that?
Yeah. This has happened so many times, like time and again, where we have to go back and educate the market and re-educate the market for various reasons. In fact, we're doing some of that even now. We did some of that collectively, in the blockchain collective, in the various talks and conversations and panels that happened at Davos. I'm referring to that since that was really most recent. And part of it is, and you mentioned regulators, right? So, not just regulators, like just a larger demographics and audience has to be re-educated. And just because, and the example that I'm referring to now, most recently, is in the light of the crypto winter, in the light of the FTX debacle, and prior to that, the stablecoins around Terra Luna. Last year was a bloodbath. We all know that. But it was a bloodbath in crypto. It wasn't a bloodbath in blockchain. And what that basically did is that we had to step backwards. We had to pedal backwards. And that's not a good or a bad, but it's part of the stewarding that has to be done. And we had to go, educate, re-educate the population once again on the separation between crypto and blockchain. And those are two very, very different things. Crypto is one use case that runs on top of blockchain, right? And, what does that have to do with supply chains running on blockchain, or loyalty programs running on blockchain,
yes,
or dispute resolution programs?
But even this exact point which you just made, and I couldn't agree with you more, Gurvinder, right? Crypto is just one use case of blockchain, right? But even the possibility of or explaining the idea which you've just explained to me, to the average person in the street, is an extremely difficult task, right? When you introduce something like ZK, to me, it just, I don't know, you know what I mean? I have a little bit less faith in the understanding of the people that be. Yeah. So is it an issue on the user side? Do they have to have some kind of higher understanding, or is it an issue on the technology producer side? We need to be able to explain this in a way that pulls the tech out of it and just gives somebody a no-nonsense explanation of why this is valid,
Yeah. So you remember, well, you might not, you're young enough, but people of my demographics would remember, like, what really popularized the internet at the household level, at least in America, right?
I mean, I was going to say pornography and Viagra, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, certainly those catalyze the adoption, and wherever technology goes, those kind of things go with it. In fact, there is a pornography platform on blockchain. In fact, and in all fairness, it's called SpankChain on Ethereum. No, I'm serious.
I believe you,
but I'm not.
How you know about it? That's what I'm laughing about.
But I'll tell you. Here's the interesting part, right? So to bring it back to ground and innovation, and believe me, we talk about privacy, right? Do you think privacy is important to those kind of blockchains, right? Like a SpankChain? It would be, right?
So,
right? Like nobody would, like your girlfriend wouldn't want you to be, seen, or you wouldn't want your girlfriend to be seen, hovering around those kind of blockchains. But here's my point. Some of the best lessons and learnings on privacy technology on blockchains actually came out from SpankChain. Right? So that is, not really discussed in the media, in the populist kind of, industry, dribble. But there is real innovation for other use cases that comes out of these different use cases that we don't think so much of. Here's the other example, CryptoKitties. You remember that one, right? CryptoKitties was the first one to test the horsepower and the scalability and brought Ethereum down to its knees from the crunching that happened. But the other thing that it really pioneered is NFTs, right? So there are these very, very interesting alternative use cases that actually provide innovation to real business enterprise use cases. So coming back to, how we benefit from identity, privacy, that was some of the pioneering work that was spawned from, some of these fringe platforms, if I might say, fringe use cases. But then that innovation gets used by, supply chain business cases. And by the time that happens, you kind of lost the provenance.
So many people forget that the internet, like we said, right, was popularized essentially by the use of Viagra and pornography, right? And for Bitcoin, it was very much of the same. It was all you could do with Bitcoin in 2008 was either send it to someone you knew or buy drugs off the Silk Road. That was it. That was it for the longest time. And lo and behold, we've found ourselves in a $1 trillion market, right? So we tend to forget these original learnings, which have now brought us to these greener pastures, as it were. And just because they're maybe illicit and not too great to talk about, it doesn't mean there's a whole lot we can't learn from them, right? So Spank Chain is probably one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So innovation, and this also goes back a little bit to the point when you asked me, when I left from IBM over to my entrepreneurial role. Innovation can come from any direction. Innovation can come from totally unknown places. Innovation can come from totally unsuspecting sources. As we know from, military history, wars are won or could be lost for want of a nail, or for, Napoleon's buttons. So innovation can come from like anywhere. But I want to close the thread out on the point we were earlier discussing when I said like what popularized the internet, at least in America, and it was this thing called AOL Online, America Online, right? And what they did is they basically took a CD and stuffed it into everybody's mailbox, meaning physical mailbox. And when you're checking your mail and you're checking your junk mail and you see the CD, and the next thing you do is pop it into the cradle of your laptop or desktop at that time, and you get introduced to this thing called AOL, America Online, and that soundbite, you got mail, after which even a movie has been made. That was the moment, right? So that was the use case and phenomenon which brought the internet to every home in the United States, right? We don't have an AOL kind of a moment in the blockchain industry. We still struggle, as you were pointing out, on how do we convince regulators and others around zero knowledge proofs and trust, cryptographic methods, and so on and so forth. We really shouldn't have to. But it is well known that ease of use, user interfaces, these are huge risks for usability and barriers. And we still don't have. So it so happens, for better or worse, that crypto tokens have been the most successful and widely used widely mature and proven use cases, aside from the ups and downs of, capital market greed. But it's not digital, it's not decentralized identity, which we were hoping for and still pushing for. It is not necessarily supply chain, even though there are several supply chain deployments that I personally have done, like for the supply chain of diamonds, for container, shipping goods, containers and logistics, for food, for micronutrition. These are all platforms that I have deployed during my role at IBM and Digital Twin Labs. But those are not the best use cases. They're not the most popular use cases. So we really are missing the ease of use and the pervasive use cases, to make the adoption of blockchain.
Yeah.
Kind of simple to every home and everybody.
Yeah, lovely point, Gurvinder. So I think to sort of summarize that in a really simple way, I'd say the internet had its AOL moment, AI had its ChatGPT moment,
ChatGPT moment. That's a good
and
one.
blockchain will have its own moment at some point in the future. Right. What that will be, no one knows yet, exactly. But hopefully we'll be a part of it. Corey, thank you so much for your time. Absolute pleasure. Take care of yourself. Have a great day.